So hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to the second live session webinar for the study group for Earth Regenerators. I'm your host, Joe Brewer. I'm really excited to see all of you here. According to my internal counts, we have 113 people registered, and at present, there are 38 people who are live in the session. So let's just wait a few minutes as people, or maybe 2 minutes, as more people join us. And what I'd like to say is that just as a bit of housekeeping for how to use this space, many of you are already saying hello and introducing yourselves in the chat box. In the first webinar, a lot of people found great value in having side conversations in the chat box. So I encourage you to use that and really talk amongst each other in addition to interacting with me. And also, I want to draw your attention to this button that's on the bottom in the middle of the screen called Ask a Question. And what Ask a Question will let you do is, as I am presenting or just as we're engaged in discussion, you can go there to post a question that I will be able to see and can answer it. But also, the Ask a Question box, when you open it up, will allow you to vote on questions to pick the ones you most want to hear answered. So we can vote those most popular questions up to the top. And I apologize, someone is knocking on my door outside and I'm not able to answer because I'm here. So hopefully that'll stop in just a moment. But when we get into the format for today will be that I'm going to give a brief presentation with some slides to give us a shared context for our conversation. And then I'm going to open up the rest of our time so that we can have interactive dialogue. And the Ask a Question button and the voting up of questions that you'd most like to hear answered will allow me to invite the person who asks the question into a face-to-face dialogue. So I can invite them into a shared screen where they can come on the video and actually not only ask their question, but we can have some discussion. So I invite everyone to use the Ask a Question option at the bottom of the screen, both to post questions you'd like to answer, but also to suggest topics you'd like to discuss. Because when we get to that discussion portion of the webinar, that will be our chance to interact. And also anyone that doesn't want to come onto the video and go and be recorded with this video session can just choose not to accept the video invitation and leave a message in the chat box that you don't want to come on. And then I will give a brief answer to address your question and then move on to the next person so that we can have a lot of interaction. That's one of the nice things about this Crowdcast platform is it lets us do this. So you can see now that we are sort of stabilizing at the number of people who are here. And if you look in the chat box, we have folks from all over the world, from the UK, Bulgaria, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. We have people from California, Michigan, Oregon, Virginia. We have someone from Russia, someone coming in from New York City. You can just see a lot of people are here. The reason that we have such a planetary scale engagement on this webinar is that our focus is Earth regeneration. How do we regenerate the entire planet? And many of you are probably already in the study group that is completely free to join. But if you're not, you'll see there's a button at the bottom of the screen just below the video that says join our free study group. And you can go there to join the study group and get involved in the conversations and also learn about upcoming webinars by doing that. And so what I see is someone has just posted a question about the 2020 presidential election and bridging worldviews. I think we may get to that and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of working in politics as usual and what to do to get beyond them. But first, we really want to take a bigger picture and get to a shared understanding of the topic today, which is cultural evolution of our planetary crisis. And so what I'd like to do is take maybe 20 or 30 minutes where I will share the screen and post, have a slide deck with some images and go through the presentation that will explore some of the root causes of our planetary crisis as understood through the story of human evolution. And that's going to be an opportunity during the presentation that you can ask questions, and they will accumulate in the Ask a Question section. And I won't see them until I close the presentation down, which means I will start to answer them and invite people into dialogue after the presentation portion. Also, just to let you know that we have up to 2 hours for this webinar. And in the last time that we gave a webinar for this study group, we went the entire 2 hours. But we'll be able to check in as we go along and see how much richness of conversation there is and decide if we want to go the entire 2 hours or if we want to stop a little earlier. And that will be entirely up to us as a group. And so we'll explore that as we go. For now, what I'd like to do is just say I'm really excited to have all of you here. And I want to share with you the slides I've put together about the cultural evolution of our planetary crisis. So let me go ahead and get that for us all now. Yes, here we go. And it is loading, I believe. There we are. Click to close this message. And now we can begin the slideshow. Okay, so here's the presentation. First of all, I want to say that the study group and these webinars are part of a new Design Institute for Regenerating Earth that only partially exists and currently has the 2 forms that were just mentioned. So we're starting to create this Design Institute by having an online platform for discussion and webinars. And in the future, part of my intention is to have this become on-the-ground immersive workshops and regenerative projects and other things. But we're just getting started. So thank you all for being a part of it. And our topic today is the cultural evolution of the planetary crisis. And I want to begin with this image because I find this to be so powerful. If you look at the green line, which is the rate of extinctions, the number of extinctions for non-human species with the passing of time, and you compare it to the purple line, which is the rate of growth for human population, you'll see that there's a pretty strong correlation. When human population began to rise exponentially around the year 1950, there was a rapid decrease in biodiversity across the Earth. And this is a very important thing to have in mind, which is that there's something deeply interconnected between the increasing complexity and size of the human population as we've created this globalized economic system, and the consumer patterns and the extraction and the use of resources and the impacts on land that have had catastrophic effects on non-human species that has already been occurring for decades. So there's something very important about the way that the human aspect of the Earth is changing and has been changing over time that is having profound and currently catastrophic effects on the rest of the planet. And what we want to do is try to understand how is it that one species among an estimated 10 to 100 million species, how is it that humans have been able to have such a powerful and dramatic effect? Another thing that we've talked about in the previous webinar and in the study group is that a powerful way for us to see the effect of humans on the global biosphere and the stability of the Earth is this planetary boundaries framework that was developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And what it shows us is, if you only look at the red circle, is that any of these 9 conditions or features or processes of the Earth system, any of them that are crossing the red and are colored in the red zone, are in an absolute danger stage of destabilizing and collapsing the global economy and the human presence on Earth. So the ones that have crossed into the full danger zone are the spread of nitrogen and phosphorus from the use of industrial fertilizers in agriculture, and genetic diversity, which is that extinction rate that we saw previously. And then also land systems change is outside of the blue and the red, and climate change is in number 4. What you can see is that these 4 boundaries of the planetary system have been crossed, and they're more granular or specific ways to measure how human cultural evolution, or the human presence on Earth, is having cascading consequences that destabilize the planet. And what we want to understand today is, how did humans gain the ability to do this? And how can our understanding of the human ability to do this How can that understanding inform our efforts to do regenerative work? So with that in mind, I have this provocation, a question that I asked myself several years ago. And this question was inspired by a paper written by B.F. Skinner, the founder of behaviorism, when he came to the conclusion that humans cannot become sustainable as a planetary species. Now, we can have a discussion later about the blind spots in B.F. Skinner's thinking and why he only had a partially correct answer. But this root cause that he identified is very important. What he articulated is that the ability for humans to create the ecological crisis is based in what behavioral scientists call behavioral flexibility. So this is our question. Is behavioral flexibility the root cause or a root cause of the Earth's ecological crisis? Well, what is behavioral flexibility? If we start in the bottom left of this image and look at that rock, you can see that a rock has some behaviors. It can sit, and if it's sitting in an unstable place and something knocks it over, it can roll and fall, but eventually it will come to sit stationary again at some lower place, having been affected by gravity. So there's a very limited range of behaviors that the rock has. So we would say that its flexibility of behavior is extremely low. Whereas if you move to the middle and look at this plant, this photosynthetic plant, you can see that it also has limited range of behaviors. But one thing that you might notice is that on the left is a vine that is longer than on the right. And we can infer from that 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 part of the plant has been directed towards sunlight. And if we either turned the plant around or positioned it differently so that the sun was coming from another angle, it would begin to have its primary growth direction be in the new position of the sun in relation to the plant. And this tells us that the plant has the ability to flexibly change its behavior in response to environmental factors, which means it's got more flexibility than the rock. But if we go over to the right and look at this rat, which is famous in psychology experiments for its intelligence in problem solving, because it is a social learning animal that is able to change its behavior depending on its environmental setting and what it learns from other rats in its environment. And this rat is a mammal with a brain and a central nervous system, and it has a very impressive flexibility in the behaviors that it can exhibit. So this idea of behavioral flexibility is something that we measure as the diversity of possible behaviors and the capacity to learn new and different behaviors in changing environmental contexts. Now, applied to humans, this gets really interesting because what we can see when we look back in the history of our species and even the ancestors of ours that were different species from us, like Homo habilis or Australopithecus or others that are hominids but not Homo sapiens, that all of them had incredible flexibility of behaviors. And over time, we can observe an increasing ability to learn social skills. Each new social skill bringing additional behavioral flexibility. So in the upper left is a famous Oldowan tool, a stone wedge that is used as a cutting object. This stone wedge does something quite phenomenal, which is it allows humans to cut things and then to access food supplies that they wouldn't be able to access with their fingernails or with their teeth alone. And so they have a new behavioral capacity by using this technology, this stone tool, that gives them a larger repertoire of behaviors, including a larger range of things to put on the menu that they could eat. Now, if you look just below them to the picture of the two people making a fire, that the technology of creating fire enabled an increasing range of behaviors. So the idea here is that if you look back in our ancestral history, you can see that there's something about primates, and even more generally something about mammals, but really something about primates, and then something more specific about hominids, and something distinctive about humans that has given us a behavioral flexibility that in some way is unlike other species, enabling us to do what we saw at the beginning and having the ecological impacts that we've had. Now, if we just go back about 10,000 years in time and look at a very specific developmental period, which is during what's called the Holocene, a stable, warm period of climate since the end of the last ice age, you can see that a very important developmental sequence occurred in many places around the same time, which is that in the stable climates, people began to domesticate plants and then eventually established modes of horticulture and agriculture, leading to the creation of permanent settlements. And having permanent settlements meant that they could grow their populations and start to have division of labor, different functional roles that people would perform. And this meant that you could see there was an increase of social complexity within their societies. And as they increased their social complexity with hierarchies of status and position, but also of different functional roles, some people were farmers, some people were house builders, some people were accountants, some people were emperors, some people were soldiers, and so on, that there was an explosion of behavioral flexibility. And here, the cultural diversity that I'm describing comes in two forms. One form is that during this period of stable climate, a wide variety of subsistence cultures emerged, hunter-gatherer or indigenous societies. And that diversity has within it many different cultural expressions from one indigenous tribe to another. But within these city-states, these civilizations, and these empires that happened to form at the same time, there was an increasing behavioral flexibility in the kinds of technologies and the kinds of functional roles that humans could perform within their societies. So there was an increase in this behavioral flexibility that could be measured in the social complexity of the societies themselves. And that's very interesting because eventually one of these models of civilization managed to aggregate and spread and colonize the entire planet. And this all happened roughly in the last 500 years. So you can see that a kind of cultural success, and notice success is in quotations here, was achieved. And this success was a specific model of colonial domination and expansion that has achieved planetary scale. Now, what's interesting is if you look at this image on the bottom that has the words world population growth, you can see that it's looking at 10,000 years ago up to the present. And so this is entirely during the Holocene period, the stable, warm climatic period. And the first roughly half of it was mostly semi-nomadic peoples and horticulturalists. And the first stable and persistent city-states, most of those arose within the last 5,000 years. And the age of empires and civilizations mostly occurred within the last 3,000 to 4,000 years. And the industrial model of civilization and the globalized consumer market economy, what we call the global era, has only existed for about 200, maybe 300 years. So not only has there been an explosion of social complexity during this time, but it seems like there's something about this warm, stable climatic period that is important to the cultural evolution of these models of society. Now, if behavioral flexibility is one of the root causes of our ecological crisis, it's also our only way to avert disaster. And actually, for those of you who have been following my work, you'll know that I would say, quite honestly, we are not going to avert disaster because, as we saw with the extinction rate in the last 50 years, disasters have already occurred. And within the human context, if you look at widespread world hunger and starvation and mass poverty that have occurred in the industrial modern era, that those disasters have already occurred as well. So what we're talking about here is disaster of a specific kind, which is a planetary scale destabilization that leads to human extinction. If we want to avoid humans going extinct, then we will need to employ our tremendous behavioral flexibility in service to the life systems of the planet. So before we can get into how we employ these powers that humans have, these cultural abilities to regenerating the Earth, we need to have a better understanding of what they are and how they came into being. So how did humans evolve these incredible cultural capacities? Well, first of all, if we go back about 3 million years ago to those same Oldowan cutting stone tools, we can see something very powerful in the consciousness of hominid minds, which is that we can see the ability to have conceptual metaphor. When our Homo habilis ancestors would look at one of these rocks, they could project onto it with their minds a mental representation of something useful that the rock is not yet formed into. And then they can hold the object in their hand and chip away at it with another stone, turning and rotating it to have precision strikes until it becomes more and more like the cutting tool that they want it to be. This invention of metaphor is foundational to all human innovations in technology and is something of deep importance in our ancestral history, going back about 3 million years. Now, when we move forward one step in time, which is really a million years later, about 2 million years ago, when our ancestors discovered and cultivated the practices of managing fire, something amazing happened, which was a process of biological evolution that was limiting our ancestors and their ability to change was suddenly freed and liberated from this constraint. Specifically, I'm talking about something that's quite surprising to most of us, which is that the invention of fire allows an internalized bodily process, digestion, to be externalized into the environment. If we start to cook our food, then cooking starts to break down the tougher materials. It nullifies or kills the parasites and bacteria, and so it makes the food safer to eat, easier to digest, and easier to absorb the nutrients that our bodies need. Well, because our digestive systems are so intensive for energy, they limited the ability of our other primary organ for energy that also uses a lot of energy. They limited its growth, and that is the brain. So if we look at this picture to get a sense of how this works, if you look at a human compared to a gorilla and you scale them to the same size and look at the size of their gut, what you will see is a gorilla has a much larger rib cage and abdominal region than a human does by a one-to-one comparison. If you were to go in and do an anatomical study, you would find that the gorilla has intestines that are 40% longer than those of a human when we scale us to the same size. The reason for this is that the gorilla eats an entirely raw food diet, and it has to slowly digest all of that food, which is very energy intensive. Whereas humans, because we use fire and we cook, we are able to have a smaller intestine, and then relatively speaking, compared to the size of our bodies, we can have a larger brain volume. So part of the way that humans and our ancestors gained this incredible behavioral flexibility was by building upon the use of conceptual metaphor, and then building upon the ability to cook food and use fire to increase our cognitive and mental abilities by growing the size of our brains, and in particular, the neocortex, the frontal region of the brain associated with what are called higher cognitive skills. Things like executive planning, imagining, analyzing, dreaming, and lateral thinking to connect ideas that are loosely affiliated, associated with creating novelty. So all of these aspects of the frontal cortex were able to grow in size because they grew upon the cultural capacity to cook. So what's interesting here is to recognize that the invention of these early technologies created something that evolutionary biologists now call a social niche. Now, a niche is any place in the environment that an organism can find a way to survive, a place to have shelter, a place to find food, a place to reproduce, and so on. And so niches are specific relationships between organisms and their environment that enable them to live in it. What humans did was we gradually built up social niches, like having places where we would sit around a fire and share ideas and tell stories as we gradually gained the ability for symbolic language. And as we gained the ability to have shared complex semantic languages, we had social niches that were part of our environment, and evolution could unfold within those social niches. So gradually over time, our ancestors in particular went from being primarily genetically evolved to significantly cultural. What that means is that our biological and genetic evolution are still extremely important to the kind of animals that we are. But over time, our cultural aspects and these social niches have come to dominate in very important ways, in part because they can happen so much more quickly than genetic evolution. And here's an interesting way to think about this. which is that one thing that has now been identified is, maybe I'd say it this way, in the history of human studies, there has been a kind of hubris of at different times people claiming human exceptionalism and saying humans are the only ones with intelligence and other animals don't have it, or humans are the only tool users and no other animals use tools. And there are lots of these ways in the past that people have done this, where each time eventually someone would show that those researchers were closed-minded at that time, and that actually there were other animals that have intelligence, there are other animals that use tools, and they would strip away these assumptions of human exceptionalism. Well, right now, one of the few remaining forms of exceptionalism that is very well documented and seems to be very robust is that humans have a cultural ability to accumulate cultural evolution and have it build on the cultural evolution that came before in ways that are qualitatively different from any other species. Now, it may turn out that we find some other species that has cumulative cultural evolution, but there's a lot of research being done, and so far there's no evidence of it in other animals. So we're left to think that humans are either the only one or among a very few. And this image really shows how cumulative cultural evolution works, which is that we can build a structural cultural niche, in this case, a way of engineering and manufacturing an automobile. And then we can build on and improve it using the previous version as a kind of scaffolding. And as we scaffold on what came before, what you can see is not only do we create increasingly impressive and increasingly complex cultural innovations because they build on each other, but that they can become refined, optimized, and improved very quickly. So in this image, we're going from 1966 to 2006, so in roughly a 50-year span of time. And you can see that automobiles have changed dramatically in terms of their technologies, the materials used, their safety, whether they're made of material or plastic and what the plastics are made of and how they're designed, and on and on and on, that have accumulated into the design and manufacturing of automobiles. And this cumulative cultural evolution, as it turns out, is a major factor in how humans have built up this capacity to destabilize the entire planet. Now, there's another thing that people have been calling the Great Acceleration. It's hard to see in this image because there are so many small graphs, but if you can see the small numbers in red at the bottom of each image, that is the year, that red spot in the vertical dashed line in each image is the year 1950. And what you can see is from 1950 onward, there's been an acceleration, an exponential growth in a huge number of patterns. World population, gross domestic product, water use, the number of large dams, the amount of paper we produce, fertilizer consumption, transportation, international tourism, and also carbon dioxide levels, nitrous oxide levels, the amount of methane, the acidification of the world ocean, and the amount of marine fish captured, the loss of tropical forests. What you can see is all of these things are connected to each other. Now, what most people don't know is what happened around the year 1950 that caused all of this is called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, in its shortest hand, is to say that fossil fuels began to be used to produce industrial agriculture. And we started to grow a food supply based on dead sunlight stored in a carboniferous layer of the Earth's crust from 200 million years ago. We began to rapidly use it. And as we used it, we exploded the human population in all of these different activities in our industrialized economies that had all of these consequences in the Earth system. So there was something about the ability of humans to have cumulative cultural evolution combined with a globalized trade network that really grew from around the year 1500 up to the year 1950, and then was catapulted into this explosive acceleration with the use of fossil fuels about 70 years ago. So we can see that there's something about the accumulation of cultural evolution that led to this rapid acceleration. Here, I wanted to put this into words so that you could read it along with me and we can unpack how humans have destabilized the planetary system. And it goes like this. The fundamental driver of ecological change has been social niche construction. And that is because social niche construction allows cultural evolution to build on itself. You create a social niche, and then you inherit the social niche, and then you build on the inherited social niche. And this can become an exponentially growing process. It starts out slow, but it can get faster and faster and faster in the right conditions. And this pattern of creating social niches alters the flows of energy and resources. It pulls it away from non-human life, causing an accelerating extinction and a degradation of land to grow the biomass of humans. A social niche can be inherited, and it's comprised of structural supports that influence life for the next generation. An example of this is that humans born into cities inherit the built environment. They didn't have to build the transportation system or the sewage system or the subway system or whatever it may be. They inherit all that built infrastructure. And the ability to inherit it means they are able to build upon it without having to recreate it from scratch. And that is how an exponential process of cultural evolution is possible. So this social niche construction and the inheritance from it leading to exponential cultural evolutionary change is how humans have destabilized the planet. And if you want to just get a picture of that, look at these two pictures of a city about 90 years ago and that same city today. And you can see that the core infrastructure that existed 90 years ago is present now, but they have built and complexified and enriched and enlarged it dramatically in less than a century. Think about how long it took to grow the human population from 100 million to 1 billion, which is roughly 2 billion years. Or sorry, it was roughly 2 million years. Or no, it's less than that for humans. Maybe it's about 100,000 years. And here we have this level of increasing complexity in less than a century. So this is what cumulative cultural evolution, when it's running exponentially, this is what it can do. And here's another example of a city in China, where in 1984, you can see the satellite image on the left. In 2016, you can see the image on the right. And as you put them together, you can see that in this short span of roughly 30 years, humans have encroached, taken over, built upon, and dominated this landscape, taking it from non-human species. This is what I call runaway cultural evolution, when this exponential process takes off, in this case, enabled by global supply chains, industrial technologies, and fossil fuels, along with a million specific innovations that are employed within it, actually more than a million, are able to have this kind of effect in very short amounts of time. So here's the thing. Humans evolve through genetics and culture, and genes and culture can co-evolve together so that a cultural change can alter the environment of biological evolution. We start cooking food, and it opens up a genetic pathway for increasing the size of our brains by reducing the size of our guts. So genes and cultures feed each other, influence each other, and constrain each other all at the same time. And this allows for the culture to be fit or adapted to itself when it may not be adapted to its environment, which in the current moment is shortening the lifespan of Earth's biosphere, or at least it could if we drove the planet to extinction. That's not very likely to occur, but right now we're doing things that 100 years ago most people thought were impossible. So we want to just recognize that this cultural evolution power of humans is powerful, and it's more powerful than most of us realize. So what if we tried to be wise and intelligent and have foresight and employ this cultural evolutionary power? One idea is to imagine that every place on Earth where social change occurs becomes a field site for cultural evolution research, meaning that every place where people are trying to guide social change, they actually study how the evolutionary process is happening and use that knowledge to guide where evolutionary change might go. This is something that is within the realm of possibility, and it's something I'd like to talk about now. Now, this graphic is really complex, and it's really just meant to convey that there are a lot of parts involved. We can do research by taking actions and looking at consequences. We can design for participation and be collaborative. We can build communities of practice. We can employ metrics of health and well-being, and so on. There are lots of things we can do to enable us to do this in every place where social change is occurring. We also can do it around specific ecological goals. like this graphic, which was created by the Regen Network, where it shows that if you create a spatial map of land and a spatial map of its ecology, then you can use the spatial coordinates of each place to measure things like how much organic carbon is in the soils, how many acres are covered by forest, what does the canopy structure look like, and what's the composition of trees and things like this, that you can actually guide a landscape from a degraded state to a fully healthy and restored state. And this is what we need to be doing in guiding cultural evolution. And there are a lot of projects seeking to do this now. What they need to know is how to build social niches that guide cultural evolution so that it's constrained away from further degradation and toward increasing ability to regenerate. And that requires us to understand how social niche construction works so that we can employ it wisely and rigorously. Now, if we are able to do this all over the planet, then we can take our basic understandings of human cultural abilities and we can build networks across the planet of place-based projects, each of them trying to regenerate their own landscape, to gradually build up a planetary capacity to heal the Earth. And that's something that I want to talk with all of you about now, is how we might go about doing that. And that's something that I'd like to begin a discussion about with all of you right now. So you can see that there's been some good discussion in the comment thread, and we have a second question that has been put into the question box. What I'd love to do right now is invite people to pose questions, and to let you know that if you write a question into the Ask a Question box, that I'm going to invite the person who asked the question. I can invite them into a shared video screen. So if you ask the question and I'm about to answer it, I will invite you to join the screen and have the conversation with me so we can have a dialogue together. And if you decide that you don't want to come on the screen, just don't accept the video invitation and leave a note in the text or in the chat box to let me know that you're not coming in, and I'll just start answering the question. So I see right now that there's a question by Jesse Henshaw, and hello, Jesse. Jesse is a friend of mine. And Jesse has asked a question that's currently in the top spot. And that question is, and Jesse, I'm going to start inviting you onto the screen so we can talk together. So let me know if you'd like to join us. And the question is, have you studied how natural growth builds durable, complex systems, going from a period of creative system building to then mature the designs to be long-lived and sustainable? So have you studied how natural growth builds durability, and how this durability allows the complexity to be long-lived? And so, Jesse, I hope you're able to join me. Sometimes there's a time delay as people figure out how to work with Crowdcast to join the call. And Jesse, if you decide not to join the call, just leave a message in the comment box. In the meantime, I'm going to start answering the question to give a little context, and then we can, oh good, Jesse's here, so I'll just wait until you come in. So hi, Jesse, how are you? It's great to see you.
Hello. How are you? Glad
there you are. Yes, so lovely to have you here. I love this question of yours, and I know this is something you've thought a lot about.
Right.
I'd love to just hear a little more of your thinking about what you intended with this question and what you would like to see us explore with it. And I can share my thoughts, but I also know that you have great thoughts to share. So I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, it's a funny thing I noticed years and years ago, that every kind of change begins with a gradual acceleration, and then that's something that physicists should have studied, but didn't. They wanted rules, and gradual accelerations of a cumulative design isn't something that ever interested physics. So, but I got interested in it, and it starts with growth starts with a period that seems like it's following a rule of using its building process, like the economy. Obviously, it's the one main thing. Of course, also Um, Organisms start with a growth process that starts with a small seed of design and then multiplies. But then with organisms and with cultures usually, or movements, social movements, they all start with a growth process. Most of them then stabilize and develop some sort of mature form.
Yeah, that's
And
sigmoidal function, or growing to a plateau state, right?
right.
Yeah.
And of course, economists think if you reach a stable state, that stagnation and should be immediately interrupted if possible. But um, that's economists. So we have a war between the economists and the people,
Yeah.
conceptually.
One person's work that I think may be interesting for people watching the webinar is the work of John Tyler Bonner. And he passed away last year in his mid-90s, and his focus was on developmental biology. And he looked at development across the lifespan. He also pioneered some work in the study of slime molds and how they form superorganisms, or temporary cooperating structures. And one of the things that he looked at that I thought was really fascinating, or it was really an insight that he made, which was that a lot of people who learn about evolution, just most people don't, but even those who do, only learn about the first half of the life cycle, birth to sexual maturity, to then reproduce and produce offspring. And what John Tyler Bonner got interested in was the second half of the life cycle: aging, decay, senescence, which is the breakdown of the body, the eventual death and decomposition of the body. And he made the observation that natural selection occurs across the entire lifespan, including death and decay, and that there are a lot of insights to be drawn from that side, that other half of the life cycle. And that's something I think is interesting for us to think about in relation to, there's this sigmoidal growth, this rapid growth to maturity part, which is what you were just naming. And I think that part's extremely important. There's also this other part of aging, breakdown of the body or the ecosystem, and then eventual decomposition, which opens the way for new life pathways, which is also really important.
Well, that's the senescence doesn't necessarily. It's part of every individual life, um, no matter how long. Every civilization is an individual life too, but it's not the case for life itself. Life is a process of continual regeneration, of new creativity, and economies as well. So I think you could have um, a virtually limitless life for an economy that managed to keep its creativity within bounds. And of course, that's what I study.
Yeah, that's a great living, or really historical proof of it, is 3.8 billion years of continual life on Earth. The
That's
biosphere has continually had life in exactly the way you described. I think this is really important, and it relates so powerfully to how do we wield the creative complexity of our current system, which is, got a crash course with collapse. And so it's got a senescence stage, but there's something to be redirected from within it while we have it, to employ in service to this alternative paradigm of living systems economies. I think is
in every growth system. There's a period of rapid acceleration, and then there's a period of adaptation and refinement. And there's a turn forward, is what I call it, where uh, the, uh, the the positive feedback of resources that multiply the scale of the system then gets used for future fit purposes, um, of refining and building the resilience of the system, maturing its design. And exactly how it's done is pretty easy to spot. If you look at something like an office project. Also, an office project goes through a growth process of testing more and more variations on the design, but then you get to a point where you sort of swallow hard and say, we've got to pick one of these and finish. Because if we don't finish, it's not worth anything. Well, the whole process breaks down. So it's that point where you get to the point of having to swallow hard and decide what to finish.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot we can learn by looking at these what seem like everyday examples, like an office project, and
Mm-hmm.
evolutionary lens, or through a life cycle lens. Both of them really
Uh,
can be quite helpful for us. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. I'd like to invite someone else in and talk some more, ask some more questions.
Thanks
Um,
very much.
thank you, Jesse. It's lovely to see you, by the way.
All
Lovely to
right.
see you. Um, so that's, I think, is a really important topic for us to just continue holding as we move forward, and um, and invite more conversation around. And I see that there are a few more questions entering into the Ask a Question box, and I just want to invite more people to post questions or come in with comments that you can pose as questions for us to have discussions with. And right now, there are two topics that have a vote of one. One is about the 2020 presidential election, and the other one is the Global Eco-Village Network. And Mark, if it's okay, I'd like to go with the Eco-Village Network question first, which actually it's just gotten an additional vote. And we might come back to the presidential election after, just because I think that one is closer to the themes of what we're discussing at the moment. And so, Reiner, I see you're there, and I want to just invite you in to join the conversation if you're available. And the question that we'll start to ask is, can the Global Eco-Village Network be a network of social niches? And so I believe that Reiner is coming in right now. I don't want to miss out on the presidential election in politics, so I do think it's important to discuss. Reiner, welcome. I'm glad you're here. So let's talk about the Global Eco-Village and how it relates to this idea of social niches. Tell me what you're thinking. Let's have a conversation. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, I see you there. I wonder if the audio is not coming up to you. Can you hear me right now? I think for some reason, everyone is hearing background noise. Mine, for some reason, we're not getting a good connection. And it might have something to do with the microphones, I'm not sure. So maybe I'm going to swap out of this because yeah, maybe it's, yeah, your microphone. People are asking. And maybe let me know, can you give a thumbs up if you can hear me? Yeah, it seems like it's not. So that's okay. I'll go ahead and then hopefully Reiner, you'll be able to see me. Reiner, you were there, but if for some reason it didn't seem to show you that you were there. We were able to see you, but I wasn't able to see you. So I'll just answer this question and say sorry about the technical difficulties. But the question was, can the global eco-village network be a network of social? And the answer is absolutely. And if you look at thinking about this, well, one of the things about the Oxford land movement, the different permaculture projects, the agroforestry projects, the communities, so that's the thing. Can people hear me now? Or really, I'm not coming to. I'm not sure what to do to fix it. I'm going to refresh my browser, try that, see what happens. Hello, can everyone hear me now? Is it working okay? Is this better? So just give me people give a comments in the comment thread if you can hear me now or if this working again. Okay, so it seems to be working now. Good. All right. Luckily we have Sai here with us, and he's the CEO of Crowdcast and gave me the advice to just refresh the browser, and that worked great. So thank you, Sai. All right, so back to the questions, since we sort of got sidetracked. One way of thinking of social niches is that a social niche is the constructed human environment that includes our language, our concepts, our ideas, our modes of social organization, our practices, our tools, our management frameworks, and how we interact, what our relationships are to the land and to each other. And so in all of those ways, you can see that eco-villages are social niches. The interesting question for us is, how can they be places of cumulative cultural evolution so that the eco-villages that exist now can accelerate their capacities to mature in the way that Jesse was just describing, of going from a beginning stage to a rapid growth to a full complex maturity. And I think that is a question that we need to be asking in all of the eco-villages. And as we do more ambitious regenerative work in the next few decades, how can we employ and co-create within these eco-villages and with other places on Earth that are doing similarly important work? I think that's the question for all of us. And I see the Eco-Village Network as extremely important to what we're doing. So Reiner, thank you for the question. I'm sorry we had the technical challenges there. But moving on to the next question, now that we have a nice flow, Doug Kent has asked a question, which Doug, I'll invite you onto the screen and hopefully the technology will work for you. I noticed that some people just have difficulties with the settings on their computer, and when they come into Crowdcast, we have a little challenge like this. So that just goes with the turf. But looks like while Doug's joining us, the question he's asking is, what tools are available that small communities and villages can use to evolve their local culture in a positive way with respect to regeneration? And how could we characterize the challenges where we're dealing with resistant cultural contexts? Now, this is one of those questions that's more like 100 questions in one, because there's so many ways we can go with it. And Doug, I hope you're able to join me. But even if you're not able to join, I'll go ahead and start giving some commentary. And then while you come in, I'll say one kind of tool that's really important is the collection of facilitation. Doug, are you there and can you hear me? Yeah, hi, welcome. It's great to see you. Let's talk a little bit. I was just starting to say that every facilitation technique is a tool that's useful for this. So anyone that knows how to do art or sociology or philosophy, space, there are a lot of different facilitation for
So we've seen a lot of these different things.
Okay, I'm back. We'll try it again. Maybe because we're having some problems with the technology, I'll refrain from inviting people into the split screen for discussion for now, and then we'll work on getting those those kinks worked out. So I'll start answering again so people can hear it. One of the sets of tools that's really powerful is every facilitation technique, any way of facilitating a group. So for example, the art of hosting, or World Cafe, sociocracy. There are lots of tools that people use that allow them to facilitate what they're trying to achieve together. There's the framework called pro-social that I've talked about a little bit in the study group and in the book chapters that I've been writing, which is a framework for helping groups function well together. So there are a lot of facilitation techniques that are really powerful and useful. But also there are larger scale collaboration tools like scenario planning, creating a scenario and bringing diverse perspectives of stakeholders together to create a shared understanding of the future, shared assumptions about what's going to happen, and shared values of what's happening in the present. And then they can create shared agendas based on those scenarios. And so there are a lot of tools like this that are available. I would say there are thousands of tools like this that are available. Another one would be geographic information systems, or GIS, which is creating layers of spatial data and visualizing it so that people can see and have a shared understanding of what they're working with, which enables them to work well together. And there are also a lot of workbooks and things that people can do that they can use to bring into this. So actually there are really thousands of tools. And I just want to name them more broadly to say that there's a lot, and these are just some examples of them. So thanks for the question, Doug. And we'll all just keep working with the technical challenges as we go, but I appreciate all of the help and support through the chat channel that is keeping us going. Right now I have a question that was posed by Ellen Friedman. And Ellen, if it's okay, I'm not going to invite you onto the screen since we're having some technical challenges that might have to do with bandwidth for my internet connection. I'm not sure. But I'd like to just address your question, which is, what role does decolonization play in my vision for a regenerative design path? This is followed by, is there a plan to prioritize Indigenous people and their choices when the bioregion is settled by a colonial culture? How will white supremacy be minimized in regenerative processes? And I just want to say that this is one of those questions that gets right at the heart of what I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I really want to talk about. And that is that when you looked at the slides that I shared and the story I told of human cultural evolution, I actually told a very biased story. I told the story of the dominator colonizing culture that destabilized the Earth. What I did not tell, is the story of the thousands of indigenous cultures that were either destroyed or displaced during this process. And so this is something that's extremely important. And it is something that in the book that I'm writing, I have several chapters that go into indigenous spirituality, education, what bioregionalism really is, and how it relates to indigenous cultures. So I want to say there's a lot more to say about this. For now, the piece that I think is essential is that before we can do regenerative work, we have to decolonize our own minds. This is one of the earliest steps. And there's a whole process to this that some people call unlearning, the cultural programming that we were given that was part of this domination and conquest extraction culture that sometimes is very much hidden from view. And so we have to go through processes of unlearning to make it visible, make it felt, learn how to unpack it, and then gradually learn something else. And that can be quite difficult to do. Another thing to say that is part of the answer to this question is that every civilization in history has gone through a boom-bust cycle. They are inherently unstable and they collapse. So this white supremacist, Western colonial, globalized economic system is already in the process of going through self-termination. And so what's interesting is that it will end one way or the other. Two questions that come with it are, what will it take down with it? And will we lose sacred things that we can't avoid losing? So how do we protect and safeguard those things, like indigenous knowledge that exists today? And two, as it goes down, will it happen in a bigger and worse way because we did not do regenerative work on our own mindsets? which is this decolonizing and unlearning. So the more of us that decolonize and the more of us that unlearn, the more of us are being regenerative to our own semantics, to our own mythologies, to our own identities. So there's regeneration that is internal to the self, regeneration of our own cultures. And a key part of this that's really powerful is that every human being alive today, somewhere in their blood history, they were indigenous. All of us were indigenous, but most of us have a broken lineage and we do not remember our history. And so we need to unlearn and decolonize to reconnect with the part of us that is indigenous. Another thing is that becoming bioregional is becoming the ancestor of future indigenous people, which comes in two forms. One of them is to learn from and collaborate with and support indigenous practices today. And another is to create new, appropriate and adaptive indigenous practices for the changed environments of the future. And that those two things really need to go together. So I see this as essential. And actually a powerful concept for thinking about this comes from the Algonquin tradition in the New England region of North America. And that is the concept of Wetiko or Wendigo, which is a mythological creature that comes out of the north during the dark of winter. That is a mindless, cannibalistic, consuming monster whose heart is frozen, meaning that it has no empathy. It's a psychopathic, cannibalistic killer. And when the Algonquin people saw someone like Christopher Columbus, they called him a big Wetiko. So Wetiko is a concept from an indigenous culture that can be used to help decolonize our minds. And so these are just like touch points into what I consider to be a huge and important topic. So I just want to say, Ellen, thank you for this question. It's huge, and I hope that I've done enough justice to it for the moment, but just really want to agree and resonate with how important it is and say that it's a big part of the work. So now I have a question from Rashmir. Rashmir, it's great to have you here, and I'm sorry I won't be inviting you into the call because we haven't spoken in a long time. But Rashmir has this question. I'm curious about what the social niche framework, or this way of understanding things, implies about where and what the constraints and opportunities are for raising collective consciousness, and how best to advance bringing more people on board with these approaches, even if they might seem radical to most people. So I want to start by saying this way of thinking is useful because it's a rigorous way of thinking that allows us to step outside of our own ideologies where we have judgments about what's good and what's bad within a culture, and instead look at how the culture functions. Just something that a good ethnographer will learn how to do. And as we cultivate this practice, which is a sort of functional objectivity, because we're not truly being objective. We're just looking at the function in a way that tries to be as honest and authentic as possible about how that function works. And when we do that, we can see that these social niches are ways of being alive. They're ways of having a livelihood. So a big part of transforming our lives is things like, well, where do I get my food? If I'm currently getting my food from a grocery store that's coming from industrial agriculture, and I don't want to participate in that system anymore, there's a set of social niches associated with that food system. What are the social niches associated with the food system that I want to be a part of? So, for example, do I go to the farmer's market, if there happens to be one in my town? Or if I don't live in a city, do I develop relationships with local farmers? Or do I grow food myself? And do I have my own garden or do farming myself? So these ways of asking this question are, within the social niche framework, are about creating support structures. What are the structures? What do they allow and encourage? And what do those structures inhibit or discourage? And when we ask those kinds of questions about the niches, they're functional and structural questions, then we can start to look in our lives and say, oh, if I combine this part of this niche with that part of that niche, I can create a little blend that lets me move closer to being regenerative. And then I can forgive myself for still being complicit in pathological systems, which are unethical in a structural way, as I'm getting better and better at combining niches to become more and more regenerative. So that's one way to answer this question. Another way to answer this question is it lets us see things like, well, we have exponential growth or exponential change of technology. Why does that occur? We have an exponential growth in human population. Why did that occur? Is it good or bad to have exponential changes like this? Without judgment, just with understanding. And as we understand them, we become empowered to design with intentional purpose. Say, oh, I understand how they function now. I can use that understanding of their function to employ the functions in the ways that they actually work to become better at design. And I see that is something that's really important for employing this framework. And it might seem radical to people to do some of these things until more of us do them. Or if we can find blends between a social niche that's new and one that's old, it feels less radical. And it's easier for people to appreciate that they don't have to change everything in their lives. So I hope that's a good enough answer for now. But I think that question is just a great question. So I see we're now actually back in the place where there are a couple of questions here. Oh, there's one that's got 2 votes that just hasn't jumped to the top yet, by Pamela Woodland. How does redirecting the energy of a web of social niches? So this is not just about a single social niche, but how to create webs of them. Oh, I'm going to go ahead and start answering Pamela's, and Barry just jumped to the top, but I didn't quite get to it yet. So I'll go ahead and answer this one from Pamela first. How does directing the energy of a web of these social niches ensure that we as individuals aren't vulnerable to the future or the present and the degradation from emotional and ideological constructs and the inherent vulnerabilities in our current, you said if you get my gist. So let me say it this way. Most of us right now have a life history that includes some form of trauma and some form of developmental stunting, meaning the way we developed as human beings has given us a more limited capacity, and that we need more capacities than we have at present. One of those is the construction of our ideologies. Another one is what I read in a really interesting psychology paper years ago called the childhood development of a consumer. Just how does marketing shape the emotional development of people to get them to become uncritical, impulsive consumers of whatever is marketed to them, so that the marketer has power over and control over the person. Which, if you look at our politics in most of the world today, you see that there is a lot of manipulation of people's base emotions and a lot of evidence that many people don't have the capacities in themselves to regulate their own emotions to make responsible decisions. So we can't collaborate and solve problems together. So I see this question as being really fundamental in that social niches support cultural development. They also support, at a smaller scale, the development of individuals across their lifespan. So like there's the whole thing about prenatal care for pregnant women, where if the woman drinks a lot of alcohol, has a lot of stress, it doesn't get enough food and is malnourished, that her body will be a developmental niche for the fetus that limits or hinders its development. In a similar way, a lot of our cultural settings are doing that to us emotionally and culturally. And so I see this idea of niche construction being powerful for constructing social settings that are developmentally powerful and developmentally restorative. So they increase our capacities. They help us deal with grief and trauma. They improve our ability to manage our emotions, improve our ability to have flexible thinking and good critical thinking skills. And that this is actually an essential piece of regenerative design. So it's really interesting, you might notice just in these last couple of questions in the discussion, that oftentimes regeneration is talked about as something that we do to the land. Here's this degraded forest, let's reforest it. But just as important is the regeneration of our cultures, regeneration of our minds, regeneration of our bodies, or as Dan Noble just put into the chat box, social niches support cultural development, right? If we have the right social niches, if they are actually nurturing, supportive social niches, they will help us develop culturally. and they'll help us develop individually so that we are better able to develop culture in a virtuous cycle of positive feedback. And so this is something that we can employ with great power by understanding how these cultural evolution processes work. So Pamela, I love that question. Thank you for asking it, and I hope that my response is adequate. I just am recognizing that we've been going for about 1 hour and 10 minutes. We are continuing to have some questions here, and I want to keep answering them, and I see various questions coming next. But what I want to do really quickly is create a poll and ask, should we go for a full 2 hours? And just say, yeah, oops. Yes or no. And so I'm going to create a poll. I'd love it if everyone would just go to this poll and say, we're at 1 hour and 10 minutes. So if people say yes, just go to the poll and answer, should we go for a full 2 hours? Should we keep going as long as there are good questions coming? Or should we wrap up sooner? And just as, you know, we got some more answers to this, so I just want to get a pulse of everyone's feelings at the moment. But just go ahead and keep answering that poll. And while you're answering it, I want to start addressing Barry's question that's here. And in the meantime, I see some questions and comments coming in through the chat box. Some of those could be turned into questions in the question box. But also if people have other questions they'd like to ask, throw them in. But right now I want to start addressing Barry's question, which is how can we develop common frameworks and data sets that will allow us to actually comprehend such a multitude of local experiments? So in Barry's opinion, the models of Henshaw, Prigogine, Buzz Hollings, and Stafford Beer, called the Viable Systems Model, are a good start to answering this question, along with limits to growth in the Planetary Boundaries Model. This is something I've been thinking a lot about too. And so what I want to say is that right now we have, in a sense, too many frameworks, and that's because we have too many nonprofit organizations. We have too many nonprofit organizations, in part because we have foundations that force people to compete for fundings rather than funding their collaboration. And so there is a social niche with many layers of elements, and I just touched a couple touch points of them, that have created this fragmentation of frameworks. And the examples that you've just given are examples of frameworks that are inherently integrative. And so let me just talk a little bit about a couple of them. So Ilya Prigogine is named here. For those of you who don't know who Ilya Prigogine is, Prigogine got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering how self-organization works in chemical systems. And so this was about how a chemical reaction could be initiated so that as it used up its inputs, it would create chemical outputs that would be the inputs for another chemical reaction that would then use them up to create another set of chemical outputs, which would be the inputs back to the first chemical reaction, and it would self-organize. And it would all be chemistry. It wasn't alive, but it had key dynamic features of being alive. And Ilya Prigogine got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for just showing how this works. So this is an example of a framework to see how patterns emerge in a complex system where the interactions between the parts are what allow the pattern to emerge as the collective behavior. And that is a framework, the framework of emergence, or the framework of self-organization, is a framework that applies across so many different things that it's inherently integrative. Similarly, the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which I showed the picture of at the beginning of the presentation, and we've talked about before, is a framework that combines a lot of dynamic elements of the planet, of the Earth system, that allow us to see how the human system connects to them. So it can become a sort of unifying or integrative framework as well. My feeling about these frameworks is that, one, we absolutely need them. They're extremely important. And two, we need to select the ones that we can connect to land-based projects, to place-based initiatives. The reason for that is that all of the regeneration of ecosystems will happen in ecosystems. And ecosystems exist somewhere in a specific estuary, a specific mountain range, a specific valley, so they're always place-based. So using place-based strategies is also a common framework. that allows us to employ these other frameworks at the same time. And my feeling is that very strongly, the more we can create coherence among our frameworks, the less we care about which frameworks it is. Because one of the things that fragments groups is the sort of ego attachment or organizational attachment for different agendas to use one framework instead of another. And that causes tensions and conflicts at times that we want to be really mindful about. So I say we select frameworks based on shared criteria for integration, but then we use them lightly so that they can all be wielded together and different ones can come and go to enable us to collaborate effectively. And my sense is that we absolutely must do this, and this is part of how we do it. So this question just highlights that. Basically saying that the use of common frameworks is the introduction of social niche. Each of these frameworks is a kind of social niche. And so they're social niches with the future capacity to be integrated. And that's why we choose to use them, which is an extremely important part of how we go about this work. So thanks so much for that question. I see Mason Youngblood has a question here that is also really a good one. Let me just go back to the poll. So from the poll, we have a pretty strong 14 yes and 1 no, so we'll just keep rolling. And if anyone needs to leave the call early, feel free. This is all going to be recorded, so you can come back and watch it later if you miss part of it. So there's no need to worry if you need to go. But it seems like we're all wanting to get as much use out of this time as we can, which means that we may want to come up with some more questions or topics that we discuss. So be thinking about if there are others you'd like to add in. But for now, I'd like to come back to Mason's question, which is, do you think runaway cultural evolution primarily applies to the rise and spread of capitalism? How can we apply lessons from small-scale societies that have, at least partially, solved the tragedy of the commons in current economic contexts? Now, I happen to know Mason and know that Mason is a student of cultural evolution and knows quite a lot about what is behind this question. So it's sort of in a sense, like a softball pitch is what we'd say in the US, is something that Mason knows that we're going to be in general agreement about it, I think. What I would say is that runaway cultural evolution has happened in every empire and every civilization. And the thing that made this current capitalist system so different was the precondition of a globalized trade network together with the development of use of fossil fuels, which creates a specific coherence and convergence in a window of time that has no historical precedent. And capitalism emerged as part of that globalized market system. So I think that the capitalism story is an important version of runaway cultural evolution that's very problematic right now. But there are other previous versions that had regional effects, but not planetary effects. And so that's part of the discussion. The other part is this question about stable societies that are smaller scale. And I would draw attention to 2 books by a man named Edward Goldsmith, or Teddy Goldsmith as he was called. And Edward Goldsmith is a cultural anthropologist who studied a lot of different hunter-gatherer societies. And he was interested in the role of religion for shaping social practices and how religion and the worldview associated with the religion connected to ecological sustainability. And he wrote 2 books. The first one is called The Way, an Ecological Worldview. And the second one is called Stable Societies. What he found was that there are stable societies, there have been stable societies, and all of them have the same social norm, like the same pattern of social norms, and the regulating function, the mechanisms of regulation for these social norms are through the religion. So each of the indigenous cultures has a spiritual system, a religious worldview, that places them within a set of kinship relationships. I, thou, personified relationships. For them, a river is not an object, the river is a person. A rock is not an object, the rock is a person. The mountain is not an object, the mountain is a person. Every ecologically important relationship is personified and is made to be sacred. And in those cultures, so there are a lot of examples of them, they do grow to a stable subsistence level, and then they stay there. And they stay there for, in some cases, 1,000 years or more. So if you look at the horticulture practices or the nomadic livestock practices of the Maasai people, for example, in East Africa, or the Kogi people in the northern Andes, you will see examples of cultures that have been relatively stable for long periods of time. And one of our opportunities, because of the advances in practices and the advances in scientific knowledge in the field of ecology, for things like agroforestry, permaculture, and other related kinds of practices, we can actually emulate what indigenous cultures have done in the past, but we can do it more quickly. So one thing you'll see in a lot of these stable societies is that they gradually accumulated cultural adaptations that allowed them to function in the place where they live. And they gradually became stable in that place. And not all indigenous cultures do this, by the way, but a lot of them have. And so these stable cultures came to the place of stability, and it might have taken them several generations. Right now, we don't have several generations. We need to do some of these things in one generation, like in the next 50 years. So we need to employ these powerful tools from ecology, from cultural evolution, and from other research areas to do intentional agroforestry, intentional reforestation, intentional permaculture to accelerate the cultural evolutionary process. And if we do that, I know part of your question was, have some of these societies solved the tragedy of the commons, which is a specific way of saying, did they avoid depleting the resources they depend upon for their survival? The answer is, yes, they solved the tragedy of the commons. And we now know how it's been done because of the work of Elinor Ostrom. She received the Nobel Prize in Economics for showing how different subsistence cultures have managed to govern common pooled resource without depleting them. So I recommend anyone go and look up Elinor Ostrom and the core design principles for managing the commons, and you will see how these different cultures did it. So that's an extremely important question, because now we can do a kind of cultural scaffolding of employing what is known about creating sustainable cultures to spread regenerative practices and to make smaller scale, more stable societies and have more of them so that they are more resilient as a global network. So I think all of that is really important as we continue in this work. We're now on to the next question, which is posted by Brian McConnell. And the question is, it seems to me the scale and acceleration of the planetary crisis we're currently facing appropriates the capacity to adapt as humans. How do we best approach prospects of facilitating our learning in that respect? Now, if I understand your question right, Brian, and just let me know in the chat box if I'm right, or maybe add a comment under the question. It seems the scale and the rate of change, the sheer size and the speed of change is so big that it overrides and overwhelms our ability to adapt. I think that's what you're saying. And if that's what you're saying, I would say I completely agree. And I even wrote an article a couple of years called The Predicament of Knowledge, which was that we produce 1 million PhDs per year now. And so we create so much knowledge every year, we can't possibly turn it into practice in the speed that we have, or in the time that we have. One of our problems is that we're doing things too big and too fast. And that means that for those of us doing regenerative work, we need to slow down and do things that are smaller. Separate ourselves from the rat race and intentionally design for longer timescales than our own lifetimes. And when we do that, what we'll see is that the acceleration that's happening cannot be stopped. A lot of people talk about stopping it. We have no mechanism that we know of that would stop it, except for the self-terminating collapse of it destabilizing and doing it to itself. It's the only one we know about. And so the task becomes not to try to stop it or try to slow it down, but instead to create parallel patterns of cultural evolution. And this relates to something that most people don't know about Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection, which is at the basis of all of these evolutionary processes. And that is in the word selection. So when Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, what he showed was that there was for any population of squirrels within a forest or earthworms within the soil or any population of a specific species in a specific place, that there would be different physical and behavioral traits. There would be existing diversity. That existing diversity is what natural selection selects upon. There's a statistical pattern that from one generation to the next, those organisms with the physical and behavioral traits that are better adapted to their environment will be slightly more successful or much more successful at producing offspring. And so in the next generation, there will be proportionally more of them than the other. So the secret to this process is the existing diversity. If there's no diversity, there's no selection. There's no selection, there's no evolution. Evolution requires this, it needs it. So this allows us to say, well, if we're going to be overwhelmed by the pace and scale of change, then what do? If we're going to be evolutionary and employ evolutionary insights, then what we need to do is create a diversity of parallel cultural experiments, knowing that some of them will fail, but some of them will succeed, and we can't predict ahead of time which will be which. And by intentionally creating this diversity, we make the experiment of human existence more resilient. Because even if only one of them continues, humans didn't go extinct, and our resilience is higher. So this challenge of being overwhelmed requires us personally to disengage from the pace and scale of change. But our strategy for addressing it is to create a diversity of parallel experiments. And if we do that, we have resilience at the level of the population, the diversity of experiments, the diversity of cultural groups. And that is the strategy for human survival and the strategy for human thriving in the future. So I hope that answers your question well enough. I think it's a really important question. So we're actually getting back to a place where I would really like, I see that Rashmir has asked a question about decolonizing, and I'd like to come back and answer that. Actually, I see people start voting up the presidential elections question, so maybe that's okay. I'll just jump to another one. If people want to talk about politics, just throw questions in and vote them up. We're happy to talk about them, or I'm happy to talk about them. I'd love to take Rashmir's question right now, because it's building on a previous one. And that is, Rashmir says, appreciate your response to the decolonization question, but I have a question in response to your suggestion that we each need to reconnect to our indigenous roots. I wonder whether we can short circuit that and reconnect directly to life in the creative field. Well, let me clarify. I actually didn't mean to say that we connect to our own indigenous roots, because most of us don't know what they are. I am at what we call an American mutt in the United States, which means I'm kind of a blend of different ancestors from different places. So I don't actually know who my indigenous ancestors are. And that's true for a lot of people. So I can't connect to indigenous roots that are literally my ancestral line. So that's not what I was implying. Actually, to reconnect to being alive and reconnecting to living in place is actually being indigenous. This is one of the more, problematic parts of how a lot of people romanticize indigenous cultures, which is they treat indigenous cultures like there's some kind of magic. And I know you don't do that, Rashmir, but some people do that. And they have this sort of romantic idea. In anthropology, this is called the myth of the noble savage, because all human groups are imperfect humans, including indigenous ones. But what's really important for us is to know what it means to actually be indigenous. To be indigenous is to have a life system for your culture and your community that is integrated fully into its place. A place-based worldview, a place-based culture, place-based mythology, place-based food, place-based textiles, place-based building construction, etc., etc., etc. All of those together as a life system is what it means to be indigenous. And so because we have such a colonizer dominance in our cultures these days, we describe indigenous as separate from this dominant kind of mainstream culture. But a lot of us have interesting roots to being indigenous already, not because of our bloodlines and ancestral history, but because we're people from a place and we feel a connection to that place. And so that's one way in to become indigenous again. And it's very much what you're talking about, connecting to the life force and life energy in the world around us, and specifically in the place where we live. And I think that's a really important thing. So thank you for asking that question, and I hope that it is answered adequately at the moment. What I would love to do is introduce another poll really quickly and say, let's see here, because I really want to invite a little more dialogue. We're at an hour and 30, and we might start wrapping up soon-ish, but I just want to know, how does everyone feel? Which is right now, how do you feel? And so I'll just say, great. Feeling done, feeling overwhelmed. Letting it soak in. And I'll just put other. So I wanted to use this because I'd love to just hear a quick feel of how everyone feels in this poll, to just let me have a feeling of what's happening, to kind of where you are emotionally right now. So I picked these descriptions to just get a sense of where we're all at. As something I know about myself personally, with a lot of life experience, is that I'm someone who can overwhelm people if I'm just talking like a fire hose, and it can be a lot to take in. And so I just wanted to get a feel. And the other category is sort of a catch-all, so it's to just let me know that you're not primarily feeling one of the first three, just to give me a sense. So it's nice to see that there's sort of a mix of being pensive and thoughtful, soaking it in, feeling pretty good, a little bit of being overwhelmed. That's kind of what I wanted to get a sense of, because I might like to just slow down for a moment and step away from answering questions just for a minute and talk about why we're having this conversation right now, which is that we're in a time in history where just in the last roughly 50 years, humans have gained all of the knowledge and skills and tools that we need to regenerate the entire planet. We did it at exactly the same time that the Great Acceleration occurred and took us to a place where we cannot regenerate the planet with that dynamic dominating, which means we're in a place of planetary scale predicament. Predicaments are complex interdependent situations that don't have a solution, so we have to navigate through them to the other side. And so this conversation about intentional, guided cultural evolution is about how we live into the honesty of that predicament and still do something useful. How do we still do something useful? And that's something that I think is just so important for all of us, is to recognize that this is a conversation that really, really matters right now. And we're maybe one of the most impactful times in human history. What we do in the next 10 or 20 years really matters. And most of us have not given ourselves enough of our reality check to be honest with ourselves about what we know is going on, and then translate that into meaningful action. We either have psychological defenses, so we don't fully grasp what's going on because it's too painful or scary, which is a pretty healthy response in most situations. It's either some part of that that's primarily driving our behavior, or we've sort of gotten past that, but we're not really able to take the steps that we know we need to take. And I feel like those of us in this study group and in these webinars are somewhere away from that first part and into that second part. Meaning we're somewhere in trying to make changes. We might already have been making changes, or we're preparing to. And we need to know better how to do it. And so that's That's why I feel like these conversations need to go back and forth between the intellectual, this is what the science says, sort of stuff, and here are the references, and go read more and keep learning, and just talking to each other so that we can have social connection and social validation about how we feel as we're dealing with all these problems, because we don't have enough spaces that are structured as social niches for this conversation. And so you can see that this webinar is a social niche for this conversation. So strengths and weaknesses, as we can see with some of the technological limitations and the fact that I'm talking more than anyone else because we have some of these technological limitations. But it's still a social niche. So think about examples like this webinar. How can we structure our own social contexts to guide our own evolutionary choices in life? I just think it's so important. And so I want to take a pause from the Q&A part, which I just keep trying to answer questions and adding more information, and just say this is why we're having such important and meaningful conversations. It's just so important to do this. So now I see that we have a couple of questions here. I see that Ben Lee has a question here that we can answer. What value is there in using ancestry research technology to help our cells or the DNA petri dish that grew them and reuniting with the bioregion that birthed them? This is like going to 23andMe and getting your ancestry through genetic markers, and then using that to connect to bioregions. What I would say is there's really not much value in it. There's personal value for people to know their own history as part of their unlearning and decolonizing. But to be bioregional really has so little to do with our historical places of adaptation. The reason is because cultural adaptations became more powerful than biological adaptation for humans. So there's this famous story, and it's described powerfully in Joe Henrich's book, The Secret of Our Success, which I'd say if you want one book to learn about the science of cultural evolution as an introduction, The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich is probably the best single sweeping book of the state of the field that was published in 2016 or 2017. So it's pretty recent. But he has a powerful way of showing how cultural adaptation works. Which is he tells a story of human beings who are very capable travelers and explorers, who are very well resourced with all of the supplies they need. They go to a place where their culture did not prepare them for, and they die a miserable death. One example is that there was a group of British explorers in a ship trying to find the Northern Passage, which is going up around Nova Scotia, going up around Canada, trying to find a way over North America to get to the Pacific on the other side. And these people were going north, and their boat got stuck in some ice, on the sheet of ice on the ocean, and they were trapped there long enough that they ran out of food, and they weren't able to move their boat. They actually lasted 2 entire winters in that space. And then they actually collapsed into cannibalism, and almost every one of the crew died. Even though they had contact with Inuit people who lived in that region for thousands of years, they had contact with them on 3 occasions. So what's interesting to notice about this is that the Inuits were perfectly capable of surviving in that extremely harsh environment, whereas these British explorers, who were very capable people, were not capable of living in that environment because they didn't have the cultural capacities. They didn't know what food to eat. They didn't know what tools to use. They didn't know how to get around in the water. They didn't know how to stay warm. They didn't know how to stay dry. There are a number of things that the Inuits' culture had given them that the British culture had not. So you see that it's not about our genetic capacity to live in a landscape. It's about our cultural capacity to be adapted to the landscape. Is the dominant, the primary way that humans survive, which is why humans have cultures that live in pretty much every landscape on Earth, with a few exceptions like Antarctica or the bottom of the ocean, or Mars if you want to go off the Earth and see places that are a bit difficult to live. But we have a pretty amazing diversity of cultural adaptations to live in different landscapes. So the answer to the question is that knowing your genetic ancestry is not that useful for being bioregional, but it's useful for decolonizing. And so it's got a different use. And And I just wanted to answer it in that way because I think it's really important. I see Jamie has a question here, which is building on Ellen's question. How can we embrace a regenerative worldview in our daily and personal lives? How can we live, think, and be really emphasized? How can we be regenerative? For example, resisting colonial ideologies such as mind over matter, logic, singularity, and so on. This is so important. As a lot of you know, my family is experimenting with ourselves to try to figure this out, raising our daughter, trying to be regenerative. It's really difficult to make the transition. One thing that I would say is that being regenerative and learning how to embody these practices is a kind of experimental prototyping. We try little things and see what works, and then we try other little things and see what works, and keep doing it. And one thing that I found that's really important is how there is a kind of entrenchment that keeps us limited and structured into anti-regenerative things by staying in the dominant paradigm. And so what I found is that if I can take a break and go far away from those structural entrenchments, go to a life that is very different, if it's just for a week or for a month or for a year or for the rest of my life, that as I disentangle myself from those constraints, I discover freedom to explore. The way my family did this was we were living in the United States. We started in Seattle. It's a big city. Our daughter was born, and then we thought it was unaffordable to live there and not really that great for raising kids. So we moved to Eugene, Oregon, a smaller city, and at that time more progressive than Seattle in terms of quality of life for families. And that freed us up because it was a less expensive place to live. But it's still, we were being pretty extracted just by living there. And so then we moved to Costa Rica and lived for 10 months off the grid in the tropical rainforest, in a place that grew most of its own food and made its own electricity. And we connected with the nature that was there. So we took this radical leap into a place that was very different, but we did it for a limited period of time. And so I think that the best way to experiment is with a kind of, you might call it ecotourism, although there are really serious limits to tourism that we could talk about a little later. But to go and experience trying living a different way in just a small kind of low risk sort of way. You know, go on vacation to this place instead of that place. Go camping in a national park instead of doing something else you might do that means you might have to travel as much or something like that. But immersing ourselves in a different context is how we decolonize our minds, is how we shift our normal, and also how we experiment with regenerative practices. So this is something that really can help us to practice living into these things, is how do we remove these structural constraints so that we can experiment and experiment without there being really negative consequences. Because we mostly don't know what to do. And so we need the ability to fail and to fail a lot. So we want low risk experiments. We can try things and then try the next thing. And that doesn't answer all of your question, but I hope it at least answers part of it. So I see I have another question here from Jesse, which is, what are the natural frameworks that we could imagine we are trying to navigate, like having taken virtuous positive feedback a little too far and needing to think of something else? Well, there are a lot. This gets at a basic question about biomimicry, which is how do we learn from the innate dynamic intelligence of life? And one way we see that growth going too far gets dealt with is to grow some bacteria in a petri dish and watch it explode, consume all its resources, and then collapse and learn the lesson. That's one way we can learn about this. Another is to just sit in nature, to find a place where there's any nature at all and just watch it, see what it's doing, and look at what the patterns are. Because there are a lot of frameworks out there. Right? Ilya Prigoghine's framework of self-organization is another good one that we talked about briefly a few minutes ago. But even more than frameworks is to step away from having a framework and just practice observing and trying to be aware of what we see. And if we have a framework, try to deconstruct it and see where it works and where it doesn't. To just practice being present in those patterns that are happening around us in nature. And I think that will really help us to learn how to do this sort of work better. Really, really an important topic. And I noticed that I didn't start answering it and stop answering it, so let's do that. Move it out of the way. Okay, so we're down here to a couple of. I see Ben Lee asked, when am I going on Michael Dowd's post-Doom series? And I went on it in September, and he hasn't published the video yet. And Michael Dowd's a good friend, and I'm helping him promote the post-Doom series. So that's just something to say about that. I see that there's a chat thread about some of the British explorers in Australia. Part of that story also is told in Joe Hendrick's book, just for those who are interested. And I think it might have been Liz who brought that in initially, because Liz has lots of great knowledge about Australia as a context for this discussion. So glad to see that's there. What else can we talk about? I see, just looking at our questions. Oh, Eddie had asked the question, what is the developed stage that you mentioned that an eco-village should get to? This is an interesting question. Let's just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I think we might want to start wrapping up, because I'm getting a feeling like we're probably at a good stopping point pretty soon. So the question was, when I was talking about the global eco-village network, and I was saying, how could they mature more quickly? The question is, what is that mature stage? How do we know when they're mature? The way I would answer that is the way that ecologists define a climax ecosystem. A climax ecosystem is when an ecosystem goes through its stages of succession, from its kind of pioneering colonies stage to the next, increasing the number of niches until it eventually stabilizes within itself and gets to its maximum complexity, and it becomes stable. Well, it turns out that not all ecosystems reach climax. Environmental changes from the outside might disrupt them and keep them in a cycle of ecological succession. Humans might come in and cut down all the forests and turn it into agriculture and intentionally keep it at an earlier stage of succession. But we know when they get to a climax stage because it becomes self-stabilizing. And that means that there's very little active management needed, or really there's no active management needed. So in permaculture, this is most beautifully demonstrated with a food forest, which has this canopy structure of 9 different elements: the tall trees, the short trees, the bushes, the vines, the ground cover, and so on. There are 9 of these levels of the canopy. And when all of them are filled in, the canopy structure becomes self-stabilizing and the system reaches climax. So you can see the parallel to this in a human system is that the ways of making a living for the human community reach a kind of dynamic equilibrium with their environment so that they don't need to become more complex. Now, there might be shifts and changes as things go along, new traditions, different practices, occasionally new technologies and things like this, but the functional complexity doesn't increase. They kind of get to a place where they're in harmony with their surroundings and they work. And you don't have to actively change the culture, actively change the management of the land and things like that, because it's just working. That's when you know you got there. And so I would say the answer to this question is to look at climax ecosystems, especially the way that they're addressed in creating food forests by permaculture designers, and then develop criteria for the eco-villages. So how would an eco-village be so integrated with its landscape that it achieves this self-stabilizing capacity? And that's how we'd answer that question. I think that this is probably a good time to start wrapping up. So what I'd like to say is that I am planning to give these webinars every 2 weeks, alternating between weekends and weekdays, because I conducted a poll of the study group members and there was a preference for both of them pretty equally. So the next one will be in about 2 weeks on a Saturday, and I'll post it pretty soon. If you follow me on Crowdcast or if you join the study group, then you'll get notices about the next webinar. And so they'll be coming every 2 weeks, and we'll evolve the topics. And I'll start a conversation in the study group about other formats we might use, like having panel discussions and invited speakers and things like that, so that we can start to make this less about me talking and have it begin to feel more like a community-oriented space. But this is only the second webinar, so we're still experimenting with the structure and learning about it. But I want to invite you to go there, because you can also post general discussion topics. And that means you can also write to me directly and suggest or request topics for future webinars, so that I can really try to be of service to all of you as we do this work. But for now, I just want to say that I hope this has been educational for everyone, and that we can continue having these conversations through the various ways of connecting. And one of the goals, it's not really a goal, but an intention that I have in my heart is for these conversations to weave together with existing projects that are on the ground, so that these conversations can accelerate, accentuate, expand, and integrate all of those other efforts, so that it can work in a fully synthesizing way among them. So thank you all for your time and attention for this lively and deep conversation. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed being here with you. So thank you all. And there will be a replay posted in a few minutes. It takes a few minutes for it to process the video. If you just come back to this link again, you can watch the full webinar anytime you like, and invite other friends to come here and watch it by sharing the link. So thank you all, and I look forward to talking more again in the near future.